Dear students, welcome to the massive open online course. Today we are going to discuss the topic called revenue expenditure under the revenue budget. My name is Dr. Milton, Assistant Professor, Department of Public Administration, Madras Christian College, Chennai. In the previous session, we were discussing about what is government budget, under government budget, what is revenue budget and what is capital budget. Just I have given you outlook on revenue receipts and revenue expenditure under revenue budget. I have just given outlook on what is capital receipts and what is capital expenditure. We discussed on revenue receipts. Under revenue receipts, what are all the major source of the government, like taxes, direct and indirect taxes. Also, we discussed on revenue receipts, whether it is repayable or non-repayable. I would like to continue from there. The other important topic under revenue budget is called revenue expenditure. The word expenditure itself clearly tells you about what is it, why do I need to spend money. Spending is called expenditure. Being an individual, I have to spend money in order to meet my day-to-day needs. That is called expenditure. Likewise, for government also, it is very much important to spend money in order to meet the day-to-day businesses. See, on the one hand, government is collecting money through various sources, direct and indirect taxes, and other source of income like dividend or interest or like repayment of loans and so on. At the same time, government is responsible to spend money for the welfare of the people. This topic, revenue expenditure, predominantly will learn you about what is the revenue expenditure for the government. First, we will discuss about what is revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure includes expenses for the day-to-day operations of the government departments and services, interest cost on government debts and subsidies, among other things. See, it is very clear that government expenditure is to meet day-to-day needs of or day-to-day, in order to perform the day-to-day operations of the government. The revenue expenditure is the amount that is spent on normal running of government departments and various services. See, government is such a big one. There are so many ministries, there are so many departments, there are so many other agencies, organizations are there under the government. So, in order to run their business, in order to spend money on administration of those departments or ministries or agencies, to meet their day-to-day needs, to run the functions of an organization, government has to spend money. That is called revenue expenditure, which means revenue expenditure will not create any assets. It is the necessary expenditure for the government in order to run the function. These are those items that do not create any assets. reduce the government's liability, which will not create any assets, reduce the government liabilities. This revenue expenditure, which is recurring in nature. What is recurring in nature? Which means it happens every month, it happens every year, it happens on every interval. So, it is a continuous process. I cannot say that no, for this month only I can give salary to the government employees, next month I will not give, probably next month we may think over. No, each and every month salary has to be given, means it has to be given. So, it is recurring in nature. It will not yield any revenue in the future. See, let me tell you very clearly about revenue expenditure. Means if money which is being spent for to meet the day-to-day operations of the government, this money cannot be invested somewhere else, through which they will not be make any profit. So, that is why which will not yield any revenue. See, if a crore rupee is given as a salary for some 100 employees, which means that is it. We cannot, government cannot expect any revenue like interest or something else from the money which is given as a salary to the employees, those who are working for the government. It is one way payment, which means it is one way payment, will not expect any money back from the organization or individual. So, it is one way transaction, not it is not a two-way transaction. Those expenditure of the government that do not lead to the creation of fixed assets are called revenue expenditure. So, these expenditures which is being spent for day-to-day business of the government is called as revenue expenditure. This will not create any assets. If asset is being created, then this comes under capital expenditure. For an example, spending money on infrastructure development, spending money on other setting up of new enterprises. So, this comes under capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure is part of the government spending that does not result in the production of the asset. Revenue expenditure, it is part of expenditure which will not create, which will not produce any asset to the government. It is purely expenditure, through which government will not be able to make any profit or any asset cannot be created. Okay. Now, we will discuss about the government spends money under various accounts. It's see, first is paying interest on loans. If Union government has taken loan from any agencies like World Bank or IMF, or if they have taken loan from the other countries, they have to pay interest. This can be monthly or yearly based on the terms. So, paying interest on loans. Second is salaries, wages and pensions. This is called revenue expenditure. At the same time, this salary will be paid from the consolidated fund of India. It is chargeable account. At the same time, for this need not to pass any bill in the parliament, because it is already charged. Month on month, this amount will be paid from the consolidated fund of India. No votes required. It is charged expenditure. Then subsidies. If Union government gives any subsidies to the state government or union territory, so considered as a revenue expenditure. Then administrative cost. As I mentioned, there are various ministries under which there are various departments who will bear the administrative cost. So, that the money which is spent on for the administration is called administrative cost, which comes under revenue expenditure. Then discount on treasury bills, grants and state union territory, for if they are giving any discount on treasury bills, comes under revenue expenditure. Whatever money is being given, grants and a state government to the state government as well as union territory, comes under revenue expenditure. See, grants made to state governments and other parties are also treated as revenue expenditure, even though these might be used for the creation of fixed assets. Let me explain you clearly. See, if union government is giving any grant to the state government, for the union government it is revenue expenditure, because it is one-way transaction. It is given as a grant. State government will not pay it back to the union government, likewise for union territories. But the grants given to the state government and union territories, which will not create any asset to the union government, so it should be considered as a revenue expenditure, because the revenue, the money, the grant which is given to the state government and union government, definitely which will not create any asset to the union government. So it is one-way transaction, hence it is considered as a revenue expenditure. But the state government and union territories can create capital expenditure from the grant which is given by the government. Let us assume 100 crore rupee grant is being given by the union government to one particular state government. After receiving this grant from the union government, state government can create an asset from that grant. Probably you may ask this question now. Sir, you said if the money is created, any asset which is considered as a capital expenditure, not as a revenue expenditure. Yes, certainly true. But here for the union government, it is revenue expenditure, because who is creating a asset from this fixed the grant which is given to the state government or union territory. The one who received the grant from the union territory will create asset from the grant received. So the actual owner of this capital is state government or union territory, not the union government. So for the union government, it is revenue expenditure. For the state government or union territory who is creating the asset by using this grant, for them it is capital expenditure. Likewise for postal deficit. If postal department not able to spend some expenditure, if the cost is more than 1 crore rupee, this money can be given by the union government, it will be considered as a revenue expenditure. See, there are certain expenditure for the postal department. See, they have to meet their expenditure from the revenue which comes from the postal department. If for any reasons, if the postal department is not able to meet their expenditure, they have a financial deficit. If it is more than 1 crore rupee, union government will give this money to the postal department in order to meet their expenditure. For the union government, it is also considered as a revenue expenditure. The expenditure made for union territory without legislation comes under the revenue expenditure. So there are two types of union territories, with legislation and without legislation. See, for the money which is being spent for the administrative purpose for the without legislation, except Delhi and Puducherry. So this is called as a administrative expenditure. This comes under revenue expenditure for the union government. If government contributes any grant to the developing countries for the welfare of the nation, is considered as revenue expenditure. See, sometimes you would have read this in the newspaper, you would have watched in the television. Sometimes government of India will contribute to the neighboring countries for the underdeveloped countries. During this COVID time, during some of the natural calamities, government of India will they'll give some grants to the neighboring countries or some other countries in order to rebuild the nation. See, this is given as a grant to the country. For an example, if government of India gives grant to the Sri Lankan government for the construction of dam, through which for our Indian government will not make any money, neither will not receive interest for the grant nor the dividend. So, it is grant. So, that this is considered as a revenue expenditure for the government of India. The government incurs revenue expenses to meet its operating demands. See, in order to meet the demands, in order to meet the operating demands, government of India, union government will spend money. This also comes under revenue expenditure. Indian government every year gives a budget with the number of revenue expenditure along with the revenue budget and capital budget. Every year you cannot see the budget without having these three things: revenue budget, expenditure along with the revenue budget and capital budget. These three things will be there in the budget. Now, we will discuss about what is capital expenditure, then you will be able to understand more detailed about revenue expenditure. Here capital expenditure means the expenditure that creates permanent assets and yield periodical income and loans given to the state and local bodies, because the loans given to the state government, union territories, local government will be repaid and it gives back the interest. See, revenue expenditure means it is given, means that is all. I will not be able to get either interest nor the actual amount nor the grant, but capital expenditure is not like that, through which they will be able to make money. It is a two-way transaction. If union government is purchasing an asset, from that asset they will be able to make money, profit, or if they are giving loans to the state government or union territories or local bodies, through which they will be able to make money, that is called interest. Over the period of time, that money, whatever money is taken from the union government, borrowed from the union government, has to repay to the government. So, it is a two-way transaction, that is capital expenditure. These are a few examples for capital expenditure. Amount invested in the public sector enterprises, it is a two-way payment, it is non-recurring in nature. So, it need not, see, if I have given loan to the one particular state, which does not mean that every year I have to give loan to the government, which does not mean that each and every year I have to invest on that public sector. It is one time payment, that is it, through which I will be able to make money like interest or from the profit sharing. This money can be recovered, definitely this can be, capital expenditure can be recovered, whereas revenue expenditure cannot be recovered. It is one-way transaction, whereas capital expenditure is two-way transaction. The profit should be created for the original owner. Who is the original owner? The one who actually invested the money. If we see previous slide, we were discussing about grant received from the union government, whereas state government or union territory, if they are creating the asset from the grant, the owner is state government. So, for the state government it is capital expenditure, for the central government it is not investment, it is grant. So, for the union government it is revenue expenditure. Again, revenue expenditure is divided into two categories. First one is for developmental expenditure, second is for non-development expenditure. What is development expenditure? Any planned expenditure is called development expenditure and any non-development expenditure is called non-planned expenditure. Okay, what is planned, what is non-planned, what is development, what is non-development? If money, development expenditure consists of social and community services such as health, education. If you see on the economic aspect, agriculture, industry, power, transportation and communication. See, if money is being spent for developmental activities of the society, it is called planned expenditure. In a simple way to understand what is planned expenditure means, if it is mentioned in the 5-year plan called planned, then if it is not mentioned in the 5-year plan, it is called non-planned expenditure. Non-development expenditure consists of expenditure on administration and defense, the money which is spent for administration and defense, including salaries and other purchasing of other materials for the defense and police, which comes under non-development. Then payment on interest on public debt. If union government has borrowed any money, the interest will be paid. That is called payment on interest on public debt. This comes under non-development expenditure. Okay. Now this planned and non-planned development expenditure, it is replaced with new classification. See, the government expenditure, which means revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure, is also classified into the planned and non-planned expenditure in accordance with the fact whether it arises out of a plan proposal or not, whether it comes under a plan or it comes under a non-plan one. The Government of India had announced in 2016 that the classification of plan expenditure, non-plan expenditure would be abolished. 2016 itself it was abolished, but now the plan and non-plan classification were removed from 2017 and 18. Henceforth, the expenditure of the government will be reclassified as capital and revenue spending. They have come up with a new classification called, from 2017 and 18 onwards, classification as reclassified as capital and revenue spending, planned and non-planned expenditure. Okay. See, this planned expenditure are defined as the expenditure on the programs that are mentioned in our country's current 5-year plan, like money spent for electricity, water, communication, transportation, agricultural and other activities, social services. These expenditure made by the central aid for state and federal needs and items under the central plan, because this is already mentioned in the 5-year plan. So it is considered as a planned expenditure. Likewise, for non-planned expenditure, the expenditure incurred on programs other than those detailed in the current 5-year plan of a country, it is known as non-expenditure. First is expenditure on defense services, payment of interest, expenditure on administrative services. These non-planned expenditure are must for every country because they are incurred on the routine functioning of the government. It happens every month, it happens every year, it is recurring, whereas that planned one, it is not recurring. That is why it is there in the 5-year plan. It is by default, it will be there. So that is why it comes under the non-planned. Money spent for the expenditure on the defense services, payment of interest, expenditure on administrative services. What is the reason? Reason for switching to capital and revenue spending classification is, the reason behind the government's decision in 2016 to switch the classification of government expenditure was the recommendation given by C.R. Rangarajan committee in 2011. The reason is, this was taken after the planning commission was dismantled. Either the decision on plan expenditure was taken after government discussion with the planning commission. It was abolished in 2016. From 2017 and 18 they have come up with a new classification. The reason, the original reason was the recommendation by the C.R. Rangarajan committee in the year of 2011. In the earlier system, expenditure more importance was given on planned expenditure. The previous one, before 2016, more importance was given on planned expenditure, which means which is there mentioned in the 5-year plan. In the newly adopted system, more importance given on expenditure of the government. Now it is mentioned in the expenditure of the government. The new capital and revenue spending classification will establish a clear and effective link between government annex, government expenditure and government outcomes. Now it is linked. All this thing will be linked as per the new classification. Just I would like to conclude the session by saying, so far we were discussing about revenue expenditure. This revenue expenditure is for the normal running of government departments and various services, interest payments and debts, subsidies, etc. revenue expenditure basically means money spent for the day-to-day businesses of the government, money spent for the various services, money spent for the interest paid for the loans taken by the union government from various agencies like World Bank or IMF or from other countries. Also money given as a subsidy to the government, state government and union territory. Also money given as a grant to the state government or union territory or to the other underdeveloped countries for their welfare. Broadly, the expenditure which does not result in creation of assets for Government of India is treated as a revenue expenditure. As I mentioned earlier, the money once it is being spent, it is one-way transaction. It is not two-way transaction like capital expenditure. If grant is given, I cannot get even single penny from the grant which is being given to the neighboring countries or any underdeveloped countries for the welfare of that particular country people. So that it is given as a grant, I cannot even get interest or I cannot ask the country or the state government union territory to repay the grant which is given. But if it is loan, yes, then it comes under capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure are unquestionably one of the most important aspect of any organization, as they aid in identifying and tweaking unnecessary expenses, making improvements as needed, judging the model's proficiency, identifying key charges and making certain projections. See, it is revenue expenditure which is unquestionable for one of the most important aspect of any expenditure. So we cannot simply say that no, I cannot spend money for this expenditure. Don't think that revenue expenditure is just a expenditure for the union government. No, in order to meet the day-to-day need, day-to-day expenditure of the ministries and departments, yes. We cannot simply say that I cannot give salary to the government employees, because they are working, they are supposed to pay it, so that this money will be given from the consolidated fund of India. It is charged amount, hence there is no voting is required. So this comes under revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure also clearly tells about wherever money is unnecessarily spent will be avoided. In 2022-2023, the government plans to spend somewhere around 39,44,909 crore rupee. According to revised projection, the government spent somewhere around 37,70,000 crore in 2021-22 and 8.2% increase over the budget forecast, with revenue spending up 8.13 and capital spending up 8.7%. Students, so far we discussed about revenue expenditure. We discussed about what is revenue expenditure, what is capital expenditure, what are all the components are there in the revenue expenditure, why revenue expenditure is important, what is the difference between loans and grants, why it is not grants considered under revenue expenditure, why loans considered as a capital expenditure, what is the revenue expenditure if money is invested on the public sector enterprises, why it is considered as asset creation, then it comes under a capital expenditure. Kindly make the following make a note of the following questions. First is, what is revenue expenditure? What is the difference between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure? What is the difference between revenue receipts and revenue expenditure? Thank you so much.